This man lost everything he had, but his faith led him to find God at the hardest moment of his life. The morning sky gave no sign of storms ahead. Sam woke up as he did on so many other days, feeling the familiar weight of worry on his tired shoulders. Born in a small rural town where time seemed to flow more slowly, he grew up hearing stories about honor, hard work, and the constant presence of God in people's lives. His mother, a woman of unwavering faith, always said the Lord never abandoned his children, not even in the darkest hours. Her words now echoed faintly, like stars whose light takes ages to reach us. Sam's life was like a straight line drawn on a sheet of paper yellowed by time. Every day, he got up at 5 in the morning, hurried through a cup of coffee and went to work at a local manufacturing plant, spending 10 hours of his day there. He'd come back exhausted to a modest home that held his most precious treasures, memories of the family he had built through so much effort. The walls of that simple house still bore echoes of his children's laughter when they were small, the pencil marks charting their growth on the kitchen doorframe, and the gentle perfume of his wife who, even years after her early passing, still seemed to linger in every corner. Yet there was something in his eyes that revealed more than the weary routine could explain. Behind those calm brown eyes, there was a faint glimmer, almost imperceptible, like a small flame refusing to die out, even though everything around suggested it should. Perhaps it was the faith he had inherited from his ancestors, now dormant, beneath layers of disillusionment and monotony. Or maybe it was simply a stubborn hope that somehow, life still had more to offer beyond that existence of shadows and silence. Sam's hands, calloused and marked by time, told stories his voice rarely shared. They carried the weight of the tools that kept him employed, yet they also showed the delicate care with which he held framed photographs from happier times. In his simple gestures, there was a quiet dignity, a silent resistance against oblivion and solitude. Fate, however, seemed to have other plans for that man whose faith lay dormant. As if life had simply been waiting for the right moment to test how far he could be pushed, trials began to fall upon him with the force of a storm long foretold but ignored. It started with a phone call on a Thursday afternoon. The voice on the other end sounded distant and impersonal. The plant where he had worked for 25 years would be shutting down in 2 weeks. A corporate decision, they said. Nothing personal, just numbers that no longer made sense on cold spreadsheets. His lifetime of dedication reduced to an inadequate severance package and a formal handshake. Sam walked home that day carrying the weight of the world. The streets in the small town felt narrower, as if they were closing in on him. The sky, once a protective canopy over his life, now seemed an expanse indifferent to his suffering. Among his co-workers, there were murmurs about the economic situation, about the near impossibility of finding new jobs at this point in their lives. Their voices echoed his own unspoken fears. He lay in bed that night, staring at the cracked ceiling, allowing a single silent tear to slide down the side of his face. It wasn't just the job he had lost. It was the framework that held his life together, the routine that brought order to the silent chaos of his thoughts, the purpose that got him out of bed each morning despite the aches in his body and the heaviness in his soul. Yet fate, in its meticulous cruelty, was only beginning to unravel the threads of misfortune it had planned for that ordinary man. 3 weeks later, while Sam was still trying to reorganize his life and look for new opportunities, he received a legal notice. The house he had lived in for 30 years, an inheritance from his parents and his only significant asset, was now in jeopardy. Years before, at a time of extreme need when his wife had fallen gravely ill, Sam had co-signed a loan for his younger brother David's promising business venture. That venture, which had once seemed solid, collapsed like a sandcastle under the first strong wave. Now the creditors were at his door, demanding payment of debts whose scale he had never even known. "You should have read the contract more carefully," the lawyer said coldly. Those words fell like stones on his already broken heart. Yes, he should have been more cautious, should have been suspicious, should have protected the little he had. But how could he deny help to his own flesh and blood? How could he turn his back when family pleaded for assistance, invoking a lifetime of shared memories? His brother vanished after the business failed, disappearing without a trace or explanation, leaving behind a mountain of debt and the bitter taste of betrayal. The unanswered calls and messages felt like small knives reminding Sam that the deepest wounds often come from those closest to our hearts. The night he was forced to leave his home was like a funeral without a body. Each item he packed seemed to contain a fragment of his soul. Every corner of that house evoked a memory that would now exist only in his mind. The kitchen walls where his wife used to make breakfast on Sunday mornings, the little yard where he planted violets in the spring, the creaky step on the staircase he always promised to fix. It all stayed behind, surrendered to strangers who would never understand the meaning of every inch of that place. Sam moved into a rented room at a rundown boarding house on the most neglected side of town. The space was so small that it barely fit his bed and an old dresser where he kept the few clothes he had decided to retain. Most of his belongings were sold to pay part of the debt or placed in a friend's garage, someone who had offered the storage space more out of pity than genuine friendship. It was in that stifling little room that Sam first felt the signs of his body rebelling. Constant headaches, a fatigue that no amount of rest could alleviate, a lingering tightness in his chest that wasn't just emotional. When he finally mustered the courage to see a doctor, spending what little savings remained, the diagnosis hit like another blow. Severe hypertension, early-stage diabetes, worrisome indicators that demanded immediate treatment and lifestyle changes. "You need to reduce stress," the doctor advised, unaware of how impossible that sounded. How could he reduce stress when everything had been taken from him? How could he find calm when the ground under his feet had vanished? How could he focus on his health when every penny had to be budgeted for the next month's survival? The medications were too expensive for his meager new budget. Follow-up appointments were a luxury he couldn't afford. Sam began rationing his meds, taking them on alternate days, fooling himself into believing it would be enough, that his body would understand the circumstances and cooperate in his poverty. Isolation came naturally, as water flows to the lowest point. Old friends called less and less. Invitations to grab coffee or have Sunday lunch simply stopped. People have an instinct to steer clear of another's misfortune, as though bad luck might be contagious. Or maybe Sam himself was pulling away, ashamed of his new reality, unwilling to face looks of pity, or worse, the polite indifference of those who no longer knew what to say in the face of endless hardship. His children, long settled and distant, cities with families and obligations of their own, offered occasional help that Sam declined out of wounded pride. "I'm doing fine." He'd lie on the phone with a conviction even he didn't believe. "Just a rough patch, it'll pass." Deep down, though, he knew he wasn't fine and feared he never would be again. Sometimes, on those sleepless nights, he wondered how long his kids would keep calling before their busy lives caused them to forget that old man in his rundown room. The days dragged on, indistinguishable from one another. Sam found occasional temporary work, helping people move, hauling boxes for grocery stores, anything his increasingly frail body could handle. The money barely covered rent and a sparse diet. Weekends, once anticipated as a respite, now only reminded him of his loneliness. It was on one of those interminable nights, lying in his narrow bed, that Sam felt something snap within him. Not a loud or dramatic break, more like the sound of a thin branch cracking under the steady weight of snow. Quiet, inevitable, final. Tears he had held back for so long finally found their release. First timidly, then in uncontrollable torrents that shook his entire body in deep sobs. He cried for everything he had lost: his job, his house, his health, his dignity. He cried for the brother who had betrayed him and the friends who had drifted away. He cried for the wife taken too soon, who might have been his only true anchor in the world. He cried for his distant children and for the grandchildren growing up without really knowing their grandfather. He cried for the childlike faith he once had, which now felt like a cruel joke in the face of so much suffering. When dawn came, it found Sam still awake, eyes swollen, spirit emptied. Too drained to stand, too weary to face yet another day exactly like the one before, he remained there, watching dust motes dance in the beams of light that slipped through the tattered curtain. Then in that moment of complete despair, something strange stirred within him. A question arose, not formed by his conscious mind, but emerging from the depths of his being. What's left when you lose everything? The question hung in the air like a restless ghost, demanding to be acknowledged. Sam closed his eyes, searching for answers he was sure did not exist. Yet something inside him shifted, like an underground current finding a crack through which to surface. That morning, for the first time in months, Sam rose before his alarm. He splashed cold water on his face, stared in the cracked mirror at the man he hardly recognized, and made a decision. He didn't know exactly what he would do or where he would go, but he knew he couldn't keep standing still, waiting for life to drag him further into the depths. He walked aimlessly through the town's streets, seeing with fresh eyes the people rushing by, each carrying unseen burdens of their own. He saw children playing in a park, indifferent to adult worries. He noticed an elderly couple holding hands on a bench, content in a comfortable silence built over decades of companionship. He watched trees persisting in their growth between slabs of concrete, their roots cracking the asphalt in a stubborn search for space and light. His steps led him beyond the town limits, down a quiet country road. The sun began to set, bathing the sky in shades of orange and pink he hadn't noticed in a long while. Sam kept walking, unmindful of his fatigue or the distance back to that miserable room. There was something freeing about simply moving with no destination, letting his body follow its own rhythm, unburdened by expectations or duties. Night fell completely by the time he stopped, suddenly aware of where he was. The empty road stretched ahead, lit only by a full moon now dominating the sky. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant chirp of crickets or a soft rustling of leaves. And there, alone under the vastness of the starlit sky, Sam felt something he couldn't name. It wasn't an audible voice or a dramatic vision. It was more like a presence, subtle but undeniable, like the breath you only see on a cold winter morning. A sense that he wasn't by himself on that road, that he had never truly been alone, even in his darkest moments. A feeling that there was a deeper purpose to his pain, a meaning beyond his limited understanding. Sam sat down by the roadside, his tired legs finally giving in. He gazed at the sky, at that blanket of stars both near and distant. Then, without warning, long forgotten, words rose to his lips, a simple prayer his mother had taught him, far too childlike for the complexity of his current situation, yet perfect in its sincerity. "Lord," he whispered into the night, "I'm lost." Just 3 words, but they held the entire weight of his shattered existence. 3 words that broke the dam he had built around his heart. And as tears flowed again, something different happened this time. It wasn't the desperate weeping of the previous night, but a near-soothing lament, like a gentle rain after a violent storm. The moonlight touched his lined face, illuminating every crease etched by time and suffering. In that silvery glow, Sam felt for the first time in a long while truly seen. Seen not as a failure or a forsaken man, but as a son returning home after a long journey through distant lands. He stayed there, motionless, for an indeterminate time, minutes or hours. It didn't matter. Time seemed to lose its power over him in that moment, suspended between earth and sky. When he finally stood, something had changed. Not his outward circumstances. His room was still miserable, his debt still loomed, his health remained frail. But the change had taken root somewhere deeper, more essential. The walk back to town felt different than the walk away. His steps, though still tired, now carried a resolve that hadn't been there before. His eyes, once fixed on the ground, looked out to the horizon, and inside his chest, where there had been only emptiness, now pulsed a quiet certainty that his story wasn't ending. This was merely the start of a new chapter. In the following days, subtle changes began to take shape, almost imperceptibly at first, but growing with time. Sam started visiting the small church on the outskirts of his neighborhood, not during regular services, but in the quiet afternoons when the place was empty and still. He'd sit on an old wooden pew and simply exist there, in a silent communion, with something greater that he no longer felt the need to name or understand intellectually. A retired pastor, noticing his regular visits, approached him one day. He didn't pry with invasive questions or offer unsolicited advice. He merely sat beside Sam and shared the silence, like someone who understands that some journeys must be traveled alone, even in the presence of others. "Pain," the pastor finally said in a soft, melodic voice that broke the silence, "isn't punishment but a path. It's not about how much we carry, but how we carry it." Simple words that resonated powerfully within Sam, less a grand revelation than a confirmation of what he had begun to sense. His pain had a purpose. His losses weren't solely subtractive, but also preparatory for something yet unseen. On a particularly difficult morning, when the arthritis in his knees was more merciless than usual, Sam found a forgotten flyer in a pew. It announced a support group for people facing financial and emotional hardships, meeting weekly in the parish hall. In earlier times, he would have ignored such a thing too, proud to admit needing help, too afraid to expose his wounds to strangers' scrutiny. But something was different now. At his first meeting, he needed courage just to sit in a circle of strangers, each with their own stories of failure and grief. Quietly, he listened to their accounts. A man who had lost his family business after risky decisions. A woman abandoned by her husband after 30 years of marriage. A young man battling addiction and the rejection of his relatives. When it was Sam's turn to speak, the words started hesitantly but then poured out with an honesty that surprised even him. He spoke about the plant closing, about losing his house, about his vanished brother, about his failing health. But he also spoke of that night on the deserted road, of the moon and the stars, of the subtle presence he had felt, and of the simple prayer that slipped through his lips. In sharing his story, he realized he wasn't merely revisiting his pain. He was also acknowledging, for the first time, the small seed of hope sprouting in the wreckage of his life. The group listened respectfully, without judgment. Some nodded in recognition. Others had tears in their eyes. Everyone connected by the invisible thread uniting those who know the bitter taste of defeat. When the meeting ended, a middle-aged man approached Sam. "I have a small woodworking shop," he said, handing Sam a simple business card. "I can't offer much, but I do need someone for a few hours a week. Someone I can count on who knows that work has value, even when the pay is modest." It wasn't the kind of offer that would drastically change Sam's finances, but it was a start, a small beacon of possibility in an ocean that had seemed endless. Sam accepted it with gratitude, unaware this apparently casual encounter would be the first of many that would help him rebuild not just his external life, but his inner world as well. The woodworking shop was peaceful, perfectly suited to the contemplative state that had taken hold of him. The smell of fresh-cut lumber, the measured rhythm of hand tools, the satisfaction of seeing a piece take shape under his hands. It all nourished something in Sam beyond the need for immediate survival. It was as though, through physical work, he was also shaping a new understanding of himself and his place in the world. His boss, Charlie, was a man of few words, but a lot of practical wisdom. He taught Sam not just woodworking techniques, but also lessons in patience and acceptance. "Wood has its own will," he'd often say. "Our job isn't to force it into something it's not, but to find what it can become." With the small wage he earned, Sam was able to rent a slightly better place to live. Still modest, but with windows that let in sunlight and enough space so he didn't feel smothered. Bit by bit, he retrieved some of his personal items from storage. Not the most materially valuable pieces, but those carrying meaningful memories. The family photo album, the pocket watch that had belonged to his father, the porcelain vase his wife had loved so much. His health remained a challenge, but now it was faced with determination rather than resignation. A social worker from the support group guided him to a government program that subsidized part of his medication costs. A newly graduated doctor, volunteering at a community clinic, offered monthly checkups at rates Sam could manage. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Sam began weaving a new web of connections. They weren't yet deep friendships like the ones he'd had in the past, but genuine relationships based on shared respect and empathy. People who didn't define him by his failures or losses, but recognized in him the same resilience they struggled to nurture in themselves. At one of the support group meetings, Sam met Mark, a man a few years younger who was going through trials similar to Sam's own. Recently divorced and battling depression and alcoholism, Mark embodied the despair Sam knew so well. Without planning to or feeling particularly qualified, Sam found himself offering the younger man not easy answers, but simply his presence and the story of his own journey. "I won't say I know exactly how you feel," Sam told Mark as they walked after a meeting. "Everyone's pain is unique, just like every person is unique. But I do know what it's like to feel the ground vanish beneath you, to believe there's no reason left to keep going. And I can tell you, no matter how impossible it seems now, there is a way forward." Sam's words were neither eloquent nor laden with grand revelations. They were simply the sincere testimony of someone who had walked through dark valleys and could now look back with a clarity that only distance brings. For Mark, at that specific moment in his life, it was exactly what he needed. That experience awakened something new in Sam. He realized his story, with all its breaks and patches, could serve as a bridge to others in the midst of their own storms. He had no definitive answers or absolute certainties to offer, only living proof that it was possible to persevere, day by day, until those days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months of gradual rebuilding. He began to participate more, actively in the meetings, not just as a listener but as someone who had something valuable to share. His voice, once hesitant, now carried a calm resolve born not from pride but from hard-earned wisdom. Each time he shared his journey, each time he reached out to someone drowning in despair, he felt something inside him grow stronger, the certainty that his suffering, however brutal, hadn't been in vain. A year passed since that night on the empty road. Sam was still working at Charlie's shop, now not just a few hours a week but full-time. His carpentry skills had significantly improved, and Charlie trusted him enough to let him oversee important projects. Sam's health, though far from perfect, was more under control thanks to consistent medical care and new daily habits. Noticing the change in his voice on phone calls, Sam's children began visiting him more often. His oldest granddaughter even spent 2 weeks of her summer break with him, helping out in the shop and listening with fascination to stories from his youth he'd never shared before. Their relationship, once governed by worry and obligation, started to blossom into something deeper and more genuine. As for his brother, there was still no word, but now, when Sam thought of him, it was no longer with the corrosive bitterness that once consumed him. Instead, he felt a gentle compassion, an understanding that everyone carries their own demons and wounds. He had forgiven, not because what happened was okay, but because he realized that resentment was far too heavy a load to keep hauling through life. On a Sunday afternoon, while tidying his small apartment, Sam came across the old family photo album. He sat in his favorite armchair, the one he'd found in a thrift store, and restored himself, and turned the yellowed pages. There were moments forever frozen in time that had once made up his life. The simple but hopeful wedding, the birth of his children, birthdays and Christmases, fishing trips with his dad, Sunday afternoons with his mom after church. He expected to feel the usual pang of nostalgia, but what arrived was different. A gentle, unwavering gratitude for every moment lived, for each person who had crossed his path, even those who brought him pain. An acceptance that life, with all its joys and tragedies, was a complex mosaic in which every piece, even the darkest ones, had its place and purpose. Closing the album, he looked out the window at a sky turning the colors of twilight. He thought about all he had lost, yes, but also about all he had found in the process. His renewed faith, not as a rigid set of beliefs, but as a quiet trust in God's constant presence in his life. The ability to see beauty in small moments, birds singing, in the morning, the taste of fresh coffee, a stranger's fleeting smile on the street. The deep understanding that true worth lies not in what we possess, but in who we are and how we touch other lives. Sam smiled, a soft, knowing smile that didn't ignore the scars, but transcended the pain that caused them. He knew his journey was far from over, that more days of doubt and discouragement would come. times when the weight of the past would press on him again. But now he carried within him an unshakable assurance, born not of dogmas or theories, but of the life he had lived in his own skin. It's precisely when we lose everything that we may discover what's truly essential. That ordinary man, who once broke down in anguished tears in a miserable room, was changed, not into someone perfect or complete, but into a person who understood that life, with all its cracks and fractures, is where the light finds its way in. That adversity, however cruel, can open portals to deeper self-knowledge and a broader perspective. That, in the end, what really matters is not how much we collect or lose along the way, but how we allow our experiences to mold and transform us. Perhaps that was the greatest lesson his journey had to offer. Even on the darkest nights, when everything seems lost and meaningless, a silent presence sustains us, an invisible thread connecting us to the vast mystery of existence. God reveals himself not in the sweeping dramatic interventions we so often hope for, but in the quiet endurance of life, in our capacity to find meaning amid hardship, in love's power to survive all storms and be rebuilt from what was destroyed. That night, as he got ready for bed, Sam heard a knock at the door. It was unusual to receive visitors so late. When he opened it, he found Mark, his face pale and eyes red from hours of crying. "Sorry for coming by so late," the younger man said in a shaky voice, "but I didn't know where else to go. Today is exactly a year since my wife left and took the kids. I thought I was prepared for the date, but the memories hit me like a landslide." Sam didn't hesitate. He opened the door wider and invited Mark in. He made some tea while the man sat silently at his small kitchen table. There wasn't much need for words right then, only presence, the mutual acknowledgement of pain, and the shared knowledge that neither of them was walking this path alone. "You know what hurts most?" Mark asked after long minutes of silence. "It's not just them being gone. It's the fear that all the suffering means nothing at all, that it's just some cruel cosmic joke with no purpose." Sam, thoughtful, watched the steam rising from the mugs. How could he convey what he himself couldn't fully express? How could he share a certainty that came not from logic or proof, but from someplace deeper, beyond words? "2 years ago, I would have agreed with you," Sam finally said. "When I lost everything, I wondered if there was any meaning or if we were just at the mercy of bad luck. I don't have absolute answers, Mark. I can't prove what I feel in a neat argument, but I learned that even in the darkest times, even when we feel completely abandoned, there's a presence that remains." Mark looked up with a mixture of skepticism and desperate hope. "How can you be so sure?" "It's not a certainty that came from outside, like some grand epiphany," Sam replied. "It grew slowly, like a seed buried under snow until you see the first sprout. It showed up in small moments of grace I began to notice. A random child's smile on the bus, the unexpected kindness of a stranger, the beauty of a sunset that felt like it was created just to soothe my broken heart." Sam paused, searching for words to capture what he had discovered in his own desert journey. "I don't believe our suffering is God's plan, like he deliberately wants us to hurt or carefully orchestrates our pain. I believe pain is part of life, arising from human choices, from random events, from the fragile nature of our bodies and minds. But I also believe that even in the deepest pain, there's a chance for transformation. Not because pain itself is good, but because we can choose how we respond to it." Mark listened intently, tears now flowing freely down his weary face. They were no longer tears of despair, but the sadness of someone finally able to release the burden they've been carrying. "How did you do it?" Mark asked quietly. "How did you turn so much loss into something you can bear without letting it crush you?" Sam gave him a gentle smile, marked by pain, but lightened by acceptance. "One step at a time, learning to look beyond the immediate horizon of my own hurt, letting myself be helped, even when my pride was screaming no, realizing that just like I needed others, there were people who needed what I could offer. And maybe most importantly, discovering that my worth as a human being was never tied to what I owned or what happened to me, but to something more essential that can't be taken away by circumstances." They talked late into the night. Not only about pain and loss, but also about hope and possibility. When Mark finally left, there was a faint spark in his eyes that hadn't been there before. The first glimmer of a new understanding that, with time and care, might flourish into something steady. After closing the door, Sam stayed up a bit longer, reflecting on the mysterious ways life moves. How could he have imagined in his darkest hour that the day would come when his own sorrow would become a guiding light for someone else lost in the storm? How could he have guessed that by losing everything he once deemed vital, he would find within himself a richness no external condition could ever take away? The next morning, on his way to Charlie's workshop under a sky-threatening rain, Sam noticed for the first time a small community garden that had sprung up on a once empty lot. Among the carefully tended flowers and vegetables stood a simple sign, "Life always finds a way." He smiled, recognizing the deep truth in those words. Yes, life does always find a way, even in the most barren soil, even after the fiercest fires. Perhaps that's the essence of the divine presence he had rediscovered. Not a distant God pulling strings from on high, but a vital force in all creation that endures, renews, and transforms, continually inviting us to take part in the eternal dance of rebirth. Over the next few months, Sam continued walking his path of rebuilding. Charlie, impressed by Sam's dedication, offered him a chance to become a small partner in the business. A modest arrangement, but one that brought more stability than Sam had ever thought possible. His health, though still requiring vigilance, stayed under control thanks to ongoing medical attention and the healthier habits he had adopted. The support group had become a crucial part of his life, not just as a source of help in hard times, but as a space where he could share his hard-earned insights and witness others' growth. Mark, in particular, had become a close friend. Together, they started a small outreach project for men going through crises like the ones they themselves had experienced. Job loss, divorce, mental health struggles, grief. It wasn't anything grand, just bi-weekly meetings in a borrowed room, tea and cookies, and a safe space to talk about pain and hope. But for those who attended, it felt like an oasis in the desert of silent male suffering. Then, one Sunday afternoon about 3 years after his ordeal began, Sam got an unexpected phone call. The voice on the other end was hesitant and almost unrecognizable. "Sam, it's David." The silence that followed was laden with the weight of years of absence and betrayal. Sam's heart sped up, emotions colliding inside him. "Where are you?" he finally managed to ask, keeping his voice steady. "In a rehab center," his brother answered. "I've been here for 6 months. I know I have no right to ask you for anything after what I did, but part of my treatment is making amends with the people I hurt, and you're at the top of that list." Sam closed his eyes, letting the words sink in. 3 years earlier, he would have met this call with fury or bitterness. Now he surprised himself by how calm he felt, how little anger remained. "Are you okay?" Sam asked, genuinely concerned. There was a pause, as if his brother was taken aback by unexpected compassion. "I'm trying to be, one day at a time, like they say here." They talked for nearly an hour. It wasn't easy. There were deep wounds to acknowledge, painful truths to face. But there was also the possibility of a fresh start, not built on forgetting the past, but on accepting what had happened and consciously deciding to build something different. After hanging up, Sam walked over to the window of his small apartment. The sun was setting, painting the horizon in gold and purple hues. He marveled at life's cycles, death and rebirth, loss and discovery, darkness and light. How it's possible for new shoots of hope to appear, even after the most devastating storms. "Thank you," he whispered to the darkening sky, to the God he had rediscovered, not in cathedral walls or scholarly theology, but in the simple grace of everyday moments. "Thank you for being there, even when I couldn't see or feel you. Thank you for showing me that losing everything can be the beginning of finding what truly matters." That night, Sam slept with a peacefulness that went beyond his external circumstances. He knew challenges and setbacks would still arise. Money would likely never be abundant. His health would continue to demand constant care. and strained relationships might not fully heal. But now he possessed something that no change in fortune could steal: the deep knowledge that he was loved not for what he owned, accomplished, or achieved, but simply because he existed. The insight that the real measure of a life is not judged by society's definition of success, but by our ability to love and be loved, to grow from our pain, and to find meaning even in the hardest moments. That certainty, born at the bleakest point of his life when all seemed lost, was the true treasure he would carry with him for the rest of his days. The wealth no one could rob, no illness could corrode, no calamity could destroy. The man who had lost everything had finally found the one thing that mattered most: the constant presence of God, not as some distant, unreachable being, but as the very force that sustains life in its most fragile hours, whispering hope when all appears doomed, transforming even our deepest wounds into gateways to a more profound and compassionate understanding of the human journey.